Welcome back. Continuing through Genesis. Everyone went back, rewatched the old YouTube videos to, catch up and be perfectly refreshed. Good. All right, so we do have the audacious task this season of trying to finish the book of Genesis. We did not get halfway through last time. However, a lot of this isn't quite as foundational, like creation, the fall, stuff that we're going to really deep dive into. So there's a lot of good, very important stuff, but it's not, we're dealing with the story of Abraham and his people now. So it kind of takes on a different tone. So tonight, I just want to do a quick review. I think we're all pretty familiar with the material, but just kind of catch us up to exactly where we stopped. So we're going to do a quick review, and we're going to be in Genesis 18 tonight. And we're going to see God visiting with Abraham and Sarah, and we're going to see Abraham's intercession for Sodom and Gomorrah. So we're going to kind of leave on a cliffhanger. I'll tell you that right off the bat. I think we all know what happens with Sodom and Gomorrah because we actually studied that pretty extensively, I think, when we did the book of Jude. So we already went through that a little bit, but we'll hit it next week and talk about some different things. Why don't I open up in prayer and we can get started. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for everyone who was able to make it out. I pray for those who wanted to be here for this time of study but can't for various medical reasons and different things going on. So Lord, we just pray you'd be with us during this time. Pray you would help us to see in your word what you have for us, the things that you want us to see, and truths that we can learn about you and who you are and how you interact with humanity and your promises that you have made ever since the beginning. So we thank you. Pray you be with us during this time. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, so why don't I throw it out to you? What do you guys remember from last season? What topics do you remember covering? Sarah and Abraham, what about them? Lovely couple, yes they are. Okay. Traveling to Egypt. Creation of the universe. That was a pretty big one. Yeah, it's a big event. The fall, all right. The flood, okay. That's very specific. Adam naming the animals. Tower of Babel, okay. Yep. And the Tower of Babel pretty much brings us to Abraham. Cain and Abel, yep. Wasn't even thinking about them. Oh, no, they are on my list. Okay, good. Yeah, so to kind of put that more in order, we saw God creating the good world that he made. Good world, his initial mandate to creation to fill and subdue and rule earth in his stead as stewards in the way that God designed things to be ruled. And then we see the fall, but then immediately after a promise of hope. We usually refer to like the snake crusher, or one who will crush the head of the serpent. We had Cain and Abel. We had the Genesis 6 rebellion and the flood after that. Babel. And then after that dispersing of the nations, the scattering of the nations at the Tower of Babel, God chooses one man to work through to bring about the fulfillment of that snake crusher prophecy. So this will end up being the people of Israel, and that prophecy will ultimately be fulfilled in Christ. So we start narrowing in, going from, the history of all humanity to the history of Abraham and his people. So God chooses Abraham, and we saw a lot of Abraham's faults and his faith. Abraham is very mixed, and we'll kind of get into some of that tonight again. He has Ishmael, the first son that he has. And why don't you turn to page 69 in your books, and there's a good recap paragraph just about precisely where we left off with Abraham. In Genesis 17, God reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham and changed his name from Abram, exalted father, to Abraham, father of multitude, or father of many nations. Circumcision would be the sign of the covenant. God changed Sarai's name to Sarah, mother of nations. Sarah would be the mother of the promised seed, and thus the mother of kings and nations. Is this not even remotely in your book? Okay. Yeah, just listen along with me then. Okay. God did not bypass Ishmael, for he made a great nation of Ishmael, but the Abrahamic covenant was to be perpetuated through Isaac, not Ishmael. Thus, Genesis 17 serves as an essential link to the rest of the history recorded in Genesis. And we'll see if the other quotes that I have are in your book. Coin toss. Maybe we'll play a game with it, like odds or evens type thing, you know. So the promise is going to be fulfilled through Isaac. And if you recall, one of the last things we saw Abraham do when God said, yeah, no, you're going to have this kid, is he fell down laughing because he thought the thing that God was saying was so ridiculous. And God reaffirms the promise, but that's sort of where we leave it. Last time, God had told them within a year, Sarah would give birth to this son, Isaac. And that's where we're going to pick up in Genesis 18. Question already? Good. Yeah, I'm going to say it's a disbelief because of the theme of Abraham's story, which we'll talk about again. I never considered that take on it, though, so I'll have to think about that and get back to you. All right, Genesis 18, verses 1 through 8. This is going to be underwhelming, just throwing it out there to start off. I'm still going to ask for your thoughts, but Genesis 18:1. And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him, and when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door, and bowed himself toward the ground, and said, My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye your hearts. After that ye shall pass on. For therefore are ye come to your servant. And they said, So do as thou hast said. And Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah, and said, Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the hearth. And Abraham ran unto the herd and fetch a calf, tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hastened to dress it. And he took butter and milk and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. It's not the craziest passage you've ever heard, but I'll still get your opening thoughts on it. What do you think? What questions do you have? Are they special? Nothing special's happened yet, right? Okay, I guess we can give away some of the plot line. They are various divine beings, we can say. It would become clear that one is the Lord, so, and we'll discuss exactly what that means. And the other 2 are angels, who we know from the famous story of going to Sodom and Gomorrah. But your question is very interesting. Does he have any idea who he's interacting with in verses 1 through 8? Maybe. I'm not totally convinced. Yeah. How would you characterize Abraham's treatment of the travelers? This is an ideal picture of ancient Near Eastern hospitality. And when you have commands later in the Bible about greeting the stranger, the foreigner, like this is an ideal picture of it, because like Pastor was saying, if you're in the ancient world traveling from even just one city to another, we take it so much for granted that you can drive 20 miles to work every morning and not think much of it. 20 miles is a day's journey at least, depending on who's traveling. So the roads are dangerous just physically, can be dangerous. If you're going to be walking outside all day, that can get dangerous. You have thieves and different ne'er-do-wells, all sorts of problems. So this is a really good image of Abraham's hospitality. And one of the reasons I'm not... Okay, so we're only covering chapter 18. The actual Sodom and Gomorrah event is chapter 19. So we'll look at both of those next week. But personally, I'm not convinced that Abraham knows exactly who he's dealing with here, just because it's not explicit in the text. So I'm hesitant to say, because he did it quickly, like people do things quickly all the time. And I think it's meant because we're going to look at an extreme lack of hospitality, to say the least, next week with Sodom and Gomorrah. I would imagine that what we're supposed to be taking is more of Abraham being a good servant and being incredibly hospitable and kind and gracious to these travelers. And then we're going to see that contrasted. But that's not a hill I'm going to die on, whether Abraham knew exactly who it was the moment he saw them. So, that is interesting. I looked into that because when I first read that in verse 3, I said, "My Lord, if now I found favor in thy sight." So that's a translation choice. So the word, you're familiar in the Bible, many times you see the word Lord and it's just like, someone who rules an area, the Lord of whatever. So this word it's not the full capital L-O-R-D, it's not the divine name. It can be used as the divine name, but when you're translating, you make a choice like, okay, are they praying and saying this word Lord? Then they're probably talking about God and you capitalize it. But if they're just talking to the ruler of an area, then they're not talking about God, and it's a normal lowercase Lord. So as far as like the Hebrew goes, you're left unclear, because as you have been a fan of saying throughout your life, Sarah called Abraham Lord. And of course, she's not, this isn't divine. This is just putting someone above yourself. And that's what he's doing with the hospitality. So depending on how you take that, absolutely could be he immediately knows it's God. And there's not a lot of transition, as we'll see, into some big revelation moment where he goes like, oh, wow, this is, like if you remember the story of Gideon, he interacts with the angel of the Lord and at first, it's just a guy standing by a tree, and then Gideon sort of gets suspicious when he starts telling him stuff, and eventually he's like, okay, look, if this is... I need you to prove you are who I think you are, and then he brings out a sacrifice, and the whole big thing happens. There's no moment like that here, so maybe he knows from the start. Maybe it's just not included in the story when he finds out. But at the very least, if we just think of them as travelers, because they're described as three men walking, I think it's a moment of personal growth for Abraham. And what I mean by this is Abraham has been told by God he will be a blessing to the nations. And so far, most times he interacts with the nations, he is a curse on the nations, like Egypt was the big example. He went down to Egypt, he lied about the nature of his relationship with Sarah, and God started raining plagues on them. He was supposed to be a blessing, but he was a curse to the nations because he didn't act the way God would want him to. And now you have foreigners, travelers coming to him, and he's 100% being a blessing. So I think that's just interesting thinking about Abraham. We'll get into the nature of the travelers a little bit more. But at the very least, because we do know the full story, we know it's God in some fashion and two angels. They pretty much eat and drink and hang out with Abraham for a while, which is very interesting. You don't normally think of angels just sitting around eating, and so they're walking towards Abraham, and you're like, from where? Where did they come from? Where did they touch down, and how far have they been traveling for the sake of this interaction? And Abraham says he's going to get water so they can wash their feet, so they're probably wearing sandals, which means their feet are dirty. And that's, that's why Jesus washing the disciples' feet, it's a very common ancient Near Eastern, you come into someone's house, they might give you water to wash your feet because that's just a needed thing. It'd kind of be like asking someone, hey, you want anything to drink? Just very common, hospitable, nice thing to do. But I always thought that was funny. Where are they coming from? Why are they... How far have they been walking? I just find it very interesting. In the heat of the day, which is probably between noon and 3, roughly. Yeah, so Abraham is doing the thing you should be doing in that area of the world in the heat of the day, and you're just chilling under your tent. They kind of have the siesta type mindset there too. Everyone takes a break around that time, so it's just way too hot to do anything productive. Okay, any more questions on that before we move on to the next section? She made and baked bread. They picked a goat, killed it, cleaned it, did all that, cooked it. That's not a quick snack. Well, yeah. And it is interesting, just again speaking to Abraham's over-the-top hospitality here. In verse 5, verse 4, he says he's going to bring them water to wash their feet, rest under the tree. Verse 5, and I'll get a morsel of bread. Okay, he's going to go get them some bread. Perfectly nice. And then he goes, hey, no, actually, Sarah, bake 3 new loaves of bread, and now I'm going to go get a goat. And so he tells them one small thing he's going to do, and then he goes over and above. Let's continue in verse 9 through 15. And they said unto him, where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, behold, in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door which was behind him. And Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said unto Abraham, wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I of a surety bear a child which am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, nay, but thou didst laugh. And these are odd little chunks of text. But what are your opening thoughts or questions with that? Yes, she did. She did lie. That's true. That's true. No, so chapter 17, so Abraham heard directly, and he laughed about it. He fell down laughing. They're taking turns with their doubt. Any other thoughts about this section of text? Doesn't have to be. All right, why do you think God keeps repeating these promises to Abraham and his family? Because he's done something of this nature quite a few times, not necessarily with Isaac. This is only the second time about this promised son. But the covenant promises, all these reiterations on how the land stuff is going to happen, like God just keeps repeating these things to Abraham and his family. Why do you think he keeps doing this? Yeah, and there's a lot of time that takes place between all these events. You know, we read it in a few chapters. It might take you 10, 15 minutes to read the whole story of Abraham if you just sat down with it. But we're talking decades of this man's life. And, you know, it's funny, having the kid in the old age is like crazy, especially because of how old of an age it is. But he didn't actually, they seem to doubt this more than, yeah, you guys are going to produce a great nation. I'm going to give you this land and this land. This is going to happen. You'll be a blessing to all nations of the earth. And Abraham mostly seems to just roll with that and trust that, way off in the distant future, God will do something. But yeah, God repeats his promises to his people. And I think we see that a lot, especially in the life of Abraham. But, we need to hear the promises of God regularly, and that's at least a part of what we do in preaching and teaching and, just kind of reminding ourselves and people, what God has said. Okay, so this section gives us a rough timeline. I think we talked about this a little bit. Because last chapter, God said within a year, Sarah would have a child, and she's apparently not pregnant yet. So it hasn't been that long since he last talked to Abraham. And the last time was under very different and bizarre circumstances. Or am I blending the... No, I think that was like the blood oath covenant thing with the dead animals split apart. I think that was in chapter 17. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of how God came to him, but at the very least, it wasn't three guys walking through the desert to meet him. It hasn't been that long. So yeah, in verse 10, we have a reiteration of the promise. We know they're well past childbearing years, and even though they live longer than we do, it still seems that 100 is 100. They don't seem to be able to get around that. So why did Sarah laugh? We can kind of sympathize with her, I guess, right? Yeah, if we at least can't say for certainty what Abraham knows in this situation, she's in a tent. We have no evidence she even sees the people. She's just hearing through a tent. I mean, she might have thought it. Yeah, she probably wouldn't have said it, but... Well, yeah, so that was the thing where initially it was, through Abraham that, they'll have a son. And Sarah wasn't specified initially. It's just, it's the son of Abraham, and this is your wife. And then instead of having faith or patience, they decided to take that into their own hands and try to do that bizarre legal trade thing through Hagar. Verse 14, great verse. Is anything too hard for the Lord? I forget, like Jeremiah I should have looked it up. Somewhere in Jeremiah, he says, there is nothing too hard for the Lord. And it's kind of like a good answer, even though this is a fairly clear rhetorical question. So verse 15, Sarah denies her doubt, her laughter, because she was afraid, and that's interesting. Like, that's just an interesting little note. All right, I think we're getting way too far in the weeds on this one. Okay, so it is interesting that as far as the text goes, like try to take our speculations out of it, there has actually been zero indication, and I'm not just trying to push for my original case. Textually, there is zero indication that either at this point Abraham or Sarah are identifying these three men as anything other than three men. So even though the text says, the Lord said, he didn't go, I, the Lord, am saying, like the author, like Moses knows who this is. There's been zero indication that either of them do, which I think actually kind of points to Sarah's fear. Because at the very least, I think we can be confident she doesn't know what's going on. But then you're kind of brought into this quick, like, oh my gosh, what just happened? Where, he read her mind and she denied it, and then, he knows her thoughts. But so Sarah, I think we can sort of sympathize with, even though she's revealing doubt, we can sympathize because it's still a big thing to be promised. But because of, again, the trajectory of Abraham's life that we're watching unfold and the big themes of faith, I think it's calling us to do more than, sympathize with her. It's actually calling us to look at her example of doubt and transcend that, do better than she did. And we get this with Abraham all the time as well. Abraham's faith falters and you go okay, maybe you can sympathize, but the text isn't just calling you to sympathize with faithlessness, it's calling you to greater faith. But let's move on, and we will finish. No, we're not going to finish out the rest of the chapter right now. Verses 16 through 21. And the men rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on their way. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham the thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, and the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. And the Lord said, Because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come up unto me, and if not, I will know. All right, so we're actually going to leave it there. I know not a lot happened, but I'll give you an opportunity. Any thoughts there? This will probably be a quicker section. So that seems to be referring to prayers against evil that is going on. So based on the rest of the story, likely not. However, I think you still so take Genesis 4, Abel's blood cries out from the ground. I think that's kind of the idea that's happening there. The general evil of it has kind of reached up to heaven. Yeah. Anything else from these handful of verses? Yeah, and I guess we should say, because I didn't really dig into it, so when we say that one of these men is the Lord, this is we've talked about some early formulations of the idea of the Trinity, It kind of comes up here and there because, it's the Lord, and apparently he looks like a human being, a human man. And so the Jews, the Hebrews, Israelites have a concept of God, creator of heaven and earth, can be walking around in this one specific location. So he's localized in that spot, but they have no concept that, that means he's not ruling and reigning in heaven and having his will accomplished in heaven. In Second Temple Judaism, this came to be called the two powers in heaven. So they had this very plain, from the Christian perspective, you're like, oh yeah, of course. God can be in heaven, and also God is, walking around near the shore of Galilee. And even though there's mystery involved and we don't fully comprehend it, that's not news to us. And it really wasn't news to the Jewish people either, because you have very plain things like this where God is just walking around eating lunch with Abraham, and they're perfectly fine with that. So as Christians, we would interpret a physical human manifestation of God as the second person of the Trinity. So God the Son before he's born as Jesus. Sometimes this takes the form of the angel of the Lord. That comes up in times where we study that in Judges a lot, where you have something called the angel of the Lord that is called an angel of the Lord, but then speaks as God and is worshipped as God. So it's, a very specific thing going on there. So not that it matters too much for the sake of the story, but from the Christian perspective, on this side of the cross, we would see this as an incarnation of God the Son working previously in history before he is born in a manger in Bethlehem. Okay. All right. In your book, on the bottom of page 76, hopefully there's a paragraph that starts with, "The men rose up." Awesome. "The men rose up and looked towards Sodom. Sodom's hour of reckoning had almost arrived. God had been patient long enough. His forbearance is cause for amazement. Unfortunately, we humans often presume on God's patience. So it was with the inhabitants of Sodom. Judgment was near, but in Sodom it was just another day. There was no suggestion of impending doom. God had used Abraham to deliver the people of Sodom from the kings of the east, and they had heard the testimonies of both Abraham and Melchizedek. The Sodomites were without excuse." And that's just interesting. That's not something you normally think about. We read the other story last time, the battle of the, however many kings, the battle of the Vale. He rescued the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And they knew who he was. They were there for that whole thing with Melchizedek and what was going on there. So we don't always remember the connection. But from the text, in verse 16, once again it appears these guys are just walking. They're getting everywhere on foot. They're having a big trek. They rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom. It seems like they're just walking to Sodom, however far that is. We don't have a ton of time, but I think we can cover this. Why do you think God said it was important to bring Abraham in on this situation? Okay, his nephew was there. That is true. Yep, Lot was there. So he's going to be a great and mighty nation. Let him, and it's interesting, so because they're going to be the people of God, they're going to be a great nation. He's bringing them in on the divine reality of what's happening. So to everyone else, Sodom just disappeared one day, just got wiped off the map. At least Abraham is knowing ahead of time why. Like, this is actually divine judgment. This wasn't something else. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because, I mean, this ends up being part of Israel's history for, ever. Even in the New Testament, we use Sodom and Gomorrah as just like a chief go-to example. Jesus is going to use that at different times. And the fact of Sodom's judgment in such a cataclysmic way really sticks with them forever. Yeah, let's move on. We'll kind of pull this all together. Verse 20. I put that as, angelic rumor has it that Sodom and Gomorrah is extremely sinful. But I think what's most interesting to come to with this section is, like, okay, we came up with, I think, fair explanations based on the text of why God is looping Abraham in here. But it's also clear, if you give it any thought, like we did, God doesn't have to do any of what he's doing right now. Okay, he doesn't have to investigate the situation to find out what's going on. He doesn't need to tell Abraham. And I think this should clue us in that God is at work with Abraham. And I think he has, bigger designs for it as well. But he's looping him in here for reasons other than, well, I need to get Abraham's opinion on it. Something like that. Like, he's going to Sodom and stopped by Abraham's tent, not because he needs to go and get a on-the-ground report. There's more going on as he's dealing with Abraham. We only have a couple minutes left, so let's finish up the chapter. It's 11 verses, but most of them won't have to be explained. Verse 22. And the men turned their faces from thence and went towards Sodom. But Abraham yet stood before the Lord. And Abraham drew near and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for 50 righteous that are therein? That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. And Abraham answered and said, Behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. Peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy the city for lack of 5? And he said, If I find there 45, I will not destroy it. And he spake unto him yet again, and said, Peradventure there shall be 40 found there. And he said, I will not do it for 40's sake. And he said unto him, Oh, let not the Lord be angry. I will speak. Peradventure there shall be 30 found there. And he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, Behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord. Peradventure there shall be 20 found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 20's sake. And he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak yet but this once. Peradventure 10 shall be found there, 10 righteous. And he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. And the Lord went his way as soon as he had left communing with Abraham, and Abraham returned unto his place. All right, so we don't have a ton of time to cover this. It's kind of a funny section for a host of reasons. I don't think it's supposed to be funny. Funny might be the wrong word. Funny might be the right word. Okay, so let me just say a few things before we get into the bulk of it. Verse 22, once again, angels are walking. They are hoofing it to Sodom. And the Lord hangs back with Abraham. Okay, so Abraham begins interceding on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah. And this seems to be the point of the entire exchange leading up to this. Why does God really want to bring Abraham in on this? I think it was for exactly this. So God does something very similar with Moses. And I think we may have discussed this before, but maybe not. So for all of his good qualities, Moses bounces all over the place sometimes. And one of his best moments is when God says, you know what, Moses, stand aside. I'm just going to wipe these people off the face of the earth. I'm going to start new. We're just doing this whole project over. And Moses calls upon the character of God and said, like, hey, if you do this, your name won't, be as glorified. People will mock you and your people if they all die in the wilderness. And Moses says, like, at a certain point, he says, like, take my life instead of theirs. Moses intercedes on their behalf, willing to sacrifice himself to save the sinful children of Israel. And here, I think once again, you have Abraham being that blessing to the nations, even though they don't deserve the blessing. He's standing in the gap. He's interceding on behalf of a people who are wicked, and he's kind of pleading and trying to bargain with God. And he's doing that same intercessor role. He is trying everything he can to do good for this nation. And he also, like Moses did, he turns to the character of God for his argument. When he says, will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? And apparently the answer is no, because God is willing to entertain this idea. So he starts off with 50 righteous people. If there are 50 righteous people, you don't destroy the city. I had quite a time getting an estimate on how many people would have lived in Sodom and Gomorrah. I saw everything from 20 to 30,000 to 3 to 4,000. Let's take the lowest number possible, 3 to 4,000, and you're only asking for 50. That's not a high bar to start with, let alone if you take the higher numbers. And then even though he's interceding, you watch Abraham's confidence in the people just keep dropping. He's like, 50, cool, okay, I won't destroy the city for 50. I mean, if they're missing 5, you're really going to make it hinge on like 5 people? And then he just keeps going down and down and down, and his plea gets more desperate as he keeps adding things on. Yeah. Yeah, so he eventually gets him down to 10. And God says, okay, I won't do it for 10. And despite what we normally think about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God is being gracious here. He keeps allowing Abraham to lower the bar of what it's going to take. So Abraham intercedes for the people, and I just point out again, verse 33, the Lord went his way. And like this is all this very physical, angelic stuff going on, where you're like, okay, where did they all come from? Where did God go? Like, he went his way. It doesn't say he like ascended in a flame of fire. He doesn't disappear. He walked somewhere. Yeah. It's just these very funny, like, where are they going? Where are they coming from? So yeah, just a funny little thing going on there. But okay, so we need to close. But so this is a hard chapter. I was trying to give a theme to like everything going on in this chapter, and it's hard to do that because this is an incomplete story. It will carry on next week in chapter 19. But at the very least, I think we see some aspects of Abraham's growth. Abraham is known for his faith, but as we've seen from this story and the stories before, he has to learn how to trust God through many failures. He has moments of faith and moments of failure. And here we see him trying to be a blessing to the nations that he's called to be as he tries to intercede for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. So I think we're seeing a lot of growth in Abraham as a person. And yeah, he's becoming the man that we recognize him to be as the great patriarch of these people. So yeah, I know you know how the story ends for the most part, but we're leaving it on a cliffhanger. The angels are walking off. Abraham got his intercession in, and I'll try to be more concise next week. Okay? Yeah, why don't we close in prayer? Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we could study. Even though this is an odd chapter, pray that we would meditate on it, just understand the different things that you want us to see, the different profound biblical truths that go beyond, just what's happening in Genesis 18, but some of the big themes and important ideas of who you are and what you expect of us that go well beyond the confines of this single chapter. So we thank you. Pray you'd be with us. Pray you'd bring us back safely next week. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.